Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back. Thank you so much for clicking on the video. Today we are breaking down an S tier Ice Shards Sorcerer build in Diablo 4, which includes the best skills, enchantments, aspects, and stat allocation for endgame. Now, there's no denying that the ice skills for the Sorcerer are incredibly strong right now, and until they increase the power of some of the lightning and fire skills, Sorcerer builds that focus on ice elemental abilities will remain top tier. There's a lot of different variables to this build that make it incredibly powerful. I've been completing nightmare dungeons in World Tier 3 using this build against strong elite enemies that are sometimes 10 plus levels higher than me with ease. Now, what makes this build so strong is the chain explosions and numerous opportunities to amplify your damage against chilled or frozen enemies. This build works the best against large crowds of enemies on screen, so most of your damage capabilities are crowd control based. The more enemies you freeze, the more damage you will deal, and the higher the chance of explosions to occur. For those of you grinding nightmare dungeons, I'm happy to announce that the devs are including some nice quality of life changes planned to drop before season 1 that are going to make the end game grind a lot easier. This includes the ability to fast travel to nightmare dungeons after you activate them, which is nice considering you spent a lot of time just traveling from dungeon to dungeon. They're also increasing the XP gains for completing nightmare dungeons, which is even better. If you have a sorcerer, or if you want to make a sorcerer right now, this is one of the most powerful builds to make in Diablo 4. For the basic skill, you want to use Ice Bolt. Now, when you're leveling up, most basic skills are underwhelming and really only serve as a utility to either buff yourself or nerf enemies. However, the Ice Bolt performs incredibly well in endgame, especially with the way it synergizes with the other ice skills on this build. Throw a bolt of frost at an enemy, dealing damage and chilling them for 15 seconds. This build has plenty of ways to make this basic skill do a lot of damage. For starters, the enhanced Frostbolt modifier will make your basic skill way more useful. With this modifier, Frostbolt has a 15% chance to explode on chilled enemies and a 100% chance to explode on frozen enemies. This alone makes Frostbolt one of the most important skills on this build. The core skill and the skill this whole build revolves around is Ice Shards. Ice Shards is one of the best and most consistent core skills for the Sorcerer. It works incredibly well against bosses too, thanks to its quick burst damage. With this skill, you launch 5 shards that do a lot of damage. Damage is increased by 25% to frozen enemies. So you really have two options when you freeze enemies on screen. You can make them explode with your Frostbolt skill, or you can melt their health bars using the Ice Shard skill. To make the Ice Shards even stronger, I unlocked 2 modifiers. Enhanced Ice Shards will apply a 40% chance for your Ice Shards to ricochet to another enemy. Ice Shards will always ricochet off of frozen enemies, which means you can chain this powerful attack from enemy to enemy. The Destructive Ice Shards modifier will make enemies vulnerable if they are hit with all 5 shards in a single cast. You'll also notice in a lot of this gameplay footage, I'm able to spam Ice Shards against enemies and generate mana at the same time. I'm able to do this thanks to the Frigid Breeze passive skill. Cold damage against vulnerable enemies has up to a 20% chance to generate 15 mana. The lucky hit chance on this build overall is pretty high, which is why you'll be able to do a lot of DPS. I'm using 2 defensive skills on this build that synergize really well with the Frostbolt and the Ice Shards. Ice Armor forms a barrier around your character for 6 seconds and absorbs a certain percentage of your base life and damage. This skill is great to have because it increases your survivability, but most importantly, it will keep you alive when you're stacking chill and freezing enemies. Once most of the enemies on screen have either been chilled or frozen, your shield will wear off and you can unleash some pretty big AoE damage. I also unlocked the enhanced Ice Armor modifier, which increases your mana regeneration by 25% when Ice Armor is active. The second defensive skill on this build is Frost Nova. Unleash a torrent of frost, freezing enemies around you for 4 seconds. This skill is the fastest way to freeze enemies. It will instantly put them into a frozen state, opening up the opportunity for big damage or even explosions. The best mastery skill to use on this build is Blizzard. This skill summons a blizzard over enemies that deals damage and applies chill over time. When Blizzard is active, it will make freezing enemies a lot easier, since chill is constantly building up over time. The chill will also stack with your frostbolt and ice shard attacks. The enhanced blizzard modifier increases your blizzard skill damage by 25% against frozen enemies. I'm also using the blizzard enchantment for this sorcerer, which summons a blizzard over you which follows you for 6 seconds with a 15-second cooldown. So it's basically like having 2 blizzards on your build. For the ultimate skill, you want to use Deep Freeze. Encase yourself in ice, becoming immune for 4 seconds while dealing damage and chilling enemies over time. When Deep Freeze expires, you will explode and deal additional damage to all enemies around you. To get the most out of this ultimate skill, I recommend stacking blizzards on all the enemies on screen while your ice armor is active. Once you build enough chill, freeze, and put enough enemies into a vulnerable state, you can unleash Deep Freeze and destroy everything on screen. Before we get into the skill tree, Paragon Tree, and the enchantments, I wanted to briefly go over the aspects I'm using on this build. Keep in mind my character is level 61, and most, if not all of the aspects will have higher rolls when I get to a higher level. Starting with the helmet, while within your own blizzard, you take 15% less damage. Not a significant amount of extra survivability, but for now, I think this aspect fits very well. I'm sure as I climb into level 70, 80, I'll come across a higher roll, but for now, my character is only level 61. Next, on the chest piece, basic skills grant 20% damage reduction for 2 seconds. What's nice is this is on a constant refresh, so every time you cast your basic skill, you increase your survivability overall. This will stack nicely with the first aspect that we went over, giving us a total of 35% damage reduction when Blizzard is active and when we're casting basic skills. For the gloves, while ice armor is active, you leave behind exploding ice spikes that deal damage and chill enemies for 10%. This aspect is just adding to the amount of crowd control we have on the build. This turns your basic barrier skill into a DPS skill and works great when combined with Frost Nova and Deep Freeze. For the pants, damaging an elite grants you a barrier absorbing up to 1,437 damage for 10 seconds. This effect can only happen once every 30 seconds. This is just further increasing the survivability on the build. You're basically nerfing enemies when Blizzard and Ice Bolt are active, and then adding an extra layer of protection when damaging elites. These type of defensive aspects are important, especially for higher tier Nightmare dungeons and endgame. Next, for the boots, you have 20% increased crowd control duration. While enemies are unstoppable, you deal 50% increased damage to them. This aspect is nice because it's offering 2 benefits. It increases crowd control duration, which is important since that's what this build revolves around, and then we get that extra added benefit of buffed damage against enemies that have all control impairing effects removed. So basically, once enemies break out of the frozen state and remove all status effects from themselves, your damage will be amplified by 50% against them, which means even when enemies are not crowd controlled, you can still deal a ton of damage to them when they're in their most defensive state. Next, I have the Ritual Dagger of Piercing Cold. Ice shards pierce 4 times, dealing 20% less damage per subsequent enemy hit. With the ability to hit multiple enemies at once and pierce through them, this enchantment is a valuable choice for players who want to increase their damage output and crowd control abilities. For the amulet, the Avalanche Key passive skill now applies to 1 additional cast. We're going to take a look at the entire skill tree in just a minute here, but just so you know, with Avalanche, Frost skills have up to a 10% chance for the next Ice Shards, Frozen Orb, or Blizzard cast to consume no mana and deal 40% more damage. The chance is actually doubled against vulnerable enemies, so you'll deal 80% extra damage to vulnerable enemies. This aspect alone makes this key passive skill twice as good, since you can take advantage of that damage buff for 2 attacks instead of just 1. For the first legendary ring here, deals 7% increased damage for each second you stand still, up to 30%. This is such an easy way to increase your DPS on the build. After standing for roughly 3 seconds, you'll get a huge damage buff to all of your skills. For the next ring, deal 35% more damage to immobilize, stunned, or frozen enemies. You'll notice a huge increase in DPS once you unlock this aspect and add it to your build. And lastly, for my focus, when you cast Ice Blizzard, it will periodically spawn exploding ice spikes that deal damage. Ice spikes will deal 25% extra damage to frozen enemies. Just like the aspect of my gloves, this is going to further increase your crowd control abilities. Now let's take an in-depth look at the skill and Paragon Tree. For the basic skill, Frostbolt, throw a bolt of frost at an enemy, dealing damage and chilling them for 15%. The enhanced Frostbolt modifier will make your basic skill way more useful. With this modifier, Frostbolt has a 15% chance to explode on chilled enemies and a 100% chance to explode on frozen enemies. This alone makes Frostbolt one of the best skills to use on the build. The core and main DPS skill on this build is Ice Shards. Launch 5 shards that deal damage. Damage is increased by 25% to frozen enemies. Most of your damage is going to come from this skill combined with the aspects on your gear and the key passive on this build. To make Ice Shards even stronger, I unlocked 2 modifiers. Enhanced Ice Shards will apply a 40% chance for your Ice Shards to ricochet to another enemy. Ice Shards will always ricochet off of frozen enemies, which means you can chain this powerful attack from enemy to enemy. The Destructive Ice Shards modifier will make enemies vulnerable if they are hit with all 5 shards in a single cast. Right below the Ice Shards is a passive skill that I recommend unlocking if you have some skill points to spare. Devastation increases your maximum mana by 9. Now moving to the defensive skills, we have Ice Armor and Frost Nova both selected. Ice Armor forms a barrier around your character for 6 seconds and absorbs a certain percentage of your base life in damage. This skill is great to have because it increases your overall survivability, but most importantly, it will keep you alive when you're stacking chill and trying to freeze enemies on screen. I also unlocked the Enhanced Ice Armor modifier, which increases your mana regeneration by 25% when Ice Armor is active. The second defensive skill on this build is Frost Nova. Unleash a torrent of frost, freezing enemies around you for 4 seconds. The Mystical Frost Nova modifier will make all enemies affected by this skill vulnerable. This skill is the fastest way to freeze enemies. It will instantly put them into a frozen state, opening up the opportunity for lots of damage and explosions. I also recommend unlocking 2 passive skills here. Glass Cannon increases your damage by 18%, but you take 9% extra damage in return. I think the pro definitely outweighs the con in this situation, if you ask me. The next one here is Elemental Attunement. Critical strikes have up to a 15% chance to reset the cooldown of one of your defensive skills. Can only happen once every 10 seconds. I'm not using any conjuration skills, but I am using the Precision Magic passive skill, which increases your lucky hit chance by 15%. I am using a mastery skill though, and in my opinion, the best one to use for this build is Blizzard. This skill summons a blizzard over enemies that deals damage and applies chill over time. It will stack with your Frostbolt and Ice Shard attacks. The Enhanced Blizzard modifier increases your blizzard skill damage by 25% against frozen enemies. I'm also using the Blizzard enchantment for this sorcerer, which summons a blizzard over you which follows you for 6 seconds with a 15-second cooldown. For the other enchantment, I'm using Frostbolt. Direct damage from skills applies up to 21% chill. For the ultimate skill, I recommend using Deep Freeze. Encase yourself in ice, becoming immune for 4 seconds while dealing damage and chilling enemies over time. When Deep Freeze expires, you will explode and deal additional damage to all enemies around you. Now, to get the most out of this skill, I recommend stacking as much chill and freezing as many enemies on screen as possible, so that way when you unleash this ultimate skill, they'll already be in a vulnerable state and you can do a lot more AoE damage. Do not overlook the passive skills next to your ultimate because they will make your Ice Shards build so much stronger. Permafrost increases damage dealt to elites by 15%. Hoarfrost, you deal 9% increased damage to chilled enemies and 18% extra damage to frozen enemies. Frigid Breeze is great because it helps you regenerate mana and helps you spam the Ice Shards ability. Cold damage against vulnerable enemies has up to a 20% chance to generate 15 mana. And lastly here, Icy Touch, deal 12% increased cold damage to vulnerable enemies. The best key passive skill for this build is Avalanche. With Avalanche, frost skills have up to a 10% chance for the next Ice Shards, Frozen Orb, or Blizzard cast to consume no mana and deal 40% more damage. chances doubled against vulnerable enemies. For my Paragon Tree, my dexterity, intelligence, and willpower is very high on this build, so I'm able to take advantage of pretty much every bonus in this tree so far. The resilience node to the left here increases my resistance to all elements by 12%, since I have at least 170 dexterity on this build. The Elementalist node increases my magic damage overall by 30%, since you gain an extra 10% as a bonus when you have at least 200 intelligence on the build. For the glyph socket, I think the control glyph makes the most sense for this build. So far, I've been leveling up this glyph to about level 11, I believe, which is why I'm able to deal at least 50% extra damage to crowd-controlled enemies. This glyph also allows me to deal 10% extra damage to chilled enemies and 20% increased damage to frozen enemies, obviously stacking with the other attributes on the build. The Elemental Balance node to the left here is another easy way to increase your magic damage by 30%, as long as you have at least 170 dexterity on the build to get that extra 10% bonus. That's as far as I've gone in the tree so far, but I do plan on dropping an updated version of this build once I reach max level.